She tried to hide her face with the grease-stained menu, but it was too late. The laughter echoed like sharp blades cutting through her dignity. "If you lose weight, I'll marry you. Until then, you'll continue to be the joke of the restaurant," he shouted for everyone to hear, slamming his palm on the table as if he were on a stand-up stage. His colleagues laughed mercilessly, filming with their cell phones, while she just tried to swallow her tears along with the warm juice. That night was supposed to be a reunion of college friends, but it turned into a court of public humiliation. She, with her extra pounds and simple clothes, had barely arrived. He, with his billboard good looks and inherited fortune, made a point of announcing, "That one said she was going to conquer the world. She conquered the buffet only if she did." The audience laughed, and she, with her heart in her mouth, just smiled and left without saying a word, holding back the tears with the strength of someone who has been beaten in silence since childhood. At the door, before disappearing, she turned her face away for a second and simply said, "I'll remember that, Ryan." And she disappeared into the darkness. 3 years later, a woman in a tailored white dress, a sculpted body, an upright posture, and a calm voice opened the door to her office. The room was packed. A lecture on self-esteem and emotional overcoming. She greeted each person as if they were the only one. A light smile, a direct gaze. Her name was now known, Dr. Claire Sullivan, psychologist, emotional coach, writer. Her book, Invisible Wounds, was selling like hotcakes. The audience sat down to listen to her story, but she never said names. Until that day, when the last one in line came in. Grayer hair, tired eyes, rumpled suit. It was Ryan. He hesitated, tried to hide it, but froze when he looked into her eyes. There was no anger there, no mockery, just a disturbing peace. He could barely speak. He held out his hand, trembling. "Claire?" he whispered. She didn't answer. She just pointed to the chair. "Did you come for help or forgiveness?" The question hung in the air, like the light perfume she wore. And there, in that silence, began the greatest turnaround of his life. The city seemed to be always awake, even when the clock struck 3 in the morning. Mirrored buildings reflected artificial lights as if they pretended to have stars of their own. This was the world in which Ryan Walker reigned, or believed. He did. Young, handsome heir to one of the largest hotel chains in the country, he walked as if he owed no apologies to anyone. His name opened doors, his appearance guaranteed headlines, and his arrogance filled in the gaps in any conversation. He was always surrounded by people, but he was visibly alone. Gala events, private parties, sudden trips. Nothing was static in his life, except the constant emptiness that hid behind his calculated smile for the cameras. On that particular night, a group of former college friends had gathered at a trendy restaurant. Ryan arrived last, as he always did, to be noticed. Wearing a tight suit, his hair meticulously styled, his cell phone in one hand, and his ego in the other. He sat at the table with the confidence of someone who had everything under control. His friends, many of them just for convenience, soon began to show off their lives filtered through social media, fake achievements, and exaggerated laughter. The atmosphere smelled of ostentation and expensive wine. That was when a strange figure appeared. She entered shyly, wearing a simple dress and worn shoes, her hair tied up without vanity. She carried a gift in her hands, as if she still had hope that this invitation meant something real. Ryan recognized her instantly. Claire, the girl in his class who never fit in, the one who ate alone, got good grades but was invisible to everyone, including him. For a brief moment, he stared at her, not knowing how to react. But his pride got the better of him. When she approached the table, trying to smile, he stood up in a theatrical gesture and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Claire, still with the same weight and dreams of being noticed, huh?" The table burst into laughter. She froze for a second, and there, before even answering, she understood that she had entered an arena, not a gathering of friends. She sat down out of politeness, but didn't stay. She stood up with the dignity of someone who knew what that meant. She simply said, "Thanks for the reminder," and she left, leaving the gift wrapped in blue ribbon on the table. None of them opened it. They didn't even need to. The damage was done. In the days that followed, Ryan couldn't even remember what he had said. To him, it was just another joke, just another night with friends laughing at someone else's expense. But something changed. A video recorded that night leaked onto the internet. At first, there was laughter, then outrage. The comments began to explode. This isn't humor, it's cruel. This girl deserves an apology. He represents everything wrong with our generation. Ryan, accustomed to praise and filters, felt the weight of real judgment. But instead of reflecting, he tried to erase it. He had the video taken down. He denied having said it. And the more he denied it, the more the truth came out. It was the beginning of a cycle that he couldn't control. But Claire had already decided that she would never be the same again. She disappeared from the networks. She moved to another city. And she started writing. The contrast between the two grew with each passing day. While Ryan struggled with the damage to his image, Claire found strength in her pain. She began studying human behavior, taking courses, changing her diet, and starting walking at 5 in the morning. Not for aesthetics, but for discipline, for control over herself. She no longer sought acceptance, she sought purpose. And the more she got to know herself, the more her light grew. Until silently she emerged. New appearance, new profession, same name. But with the strength of 1,000 lives behind her eyes. From an early age, Claire learned that the world made no concessions to those who were different. While other girls played parade in flared dresses, she watched from the window of her small room, where the baseboards were peeling and the walls were marked with damp as if they were also crying silently. Her mother left early to work in 2 family homes and returned late, too tired to ask questions but clear-headed enough to criticize her daughter's body. "Girl, no one will want you like that." That was the phrase she heard most often in her childhood. Claire ate in secret, not out of gluttony, but for comfort. Each spoonful of stale rice with margarine was a silent refuge from loneliness. She had no siblings, no father. He had left when she was 5, leaving only a letter with empty promises and a pension that stopped, arriving in the 3rd month. At school, Claire always arrived early and left quietly. She avoided the busy hallways. She learned to sit in the corners of the classroom, to hide her belly with her notebook, to pretend she was fine. Her classmates laughed at her snack, stale bread wrapped in a grocery bag, and at her uniform, which was too tight, inherited from her cousin. But she resisted. With the books, with the essays that earned her top marks, with the drawings she made hidden in her math notebook. She dreamed of being a teacher, maybe a writer. But every dream came with the same maternal reminder. Dreams don't fill your belly. You need to find someone to support you. Claire, even when she was quiet, knew she didn't want to depend on anyone. She just didn't know how to change that. Not yet. As a teenager, things got worse. Her body grew at an uncontrolled rate. Girls her age learned to wear makeup, but she learned to deal with cramps without medication and daily mockery. Once, a group of boys stuck a sticker on her back that said, "Overflowing." She only found out when she got home. She cried in the bathroom for hours without making a sound. Her mother, as always, blamed her daughter. "If you lost weight, no one would make fun of you." And this phrase was repeated for years like a poisoned mantra that stuck in her soul. College seemed like a relief, but it was just a change of scenery for the same script. There, Claire tried to reinvent herself. She wore modest but new clothes. She got a full scholarship thanks to her impeccable report card. It was the first time anyone had called her promising, and even without friends, she felt good. Until she met Ryan. Or rather, until she noticed his presence. He was the opposite of everything she knew. Handsome, confident, rich, popular. A whole universe away. But for a brief period, he treated her kindly. He lent her books, asked questions during group work, complimented a presentation. Claire, with her heart, already accustomed to scarcity, mistook cordiality for interest. She treasured his words like jewels. She wrote down dates, imagined stories. Until, One day, she heard him say something that brought her back down to earth. "You're nice, Claire. You just need to lose a few pounds to be perfect." He said it as if commenting on the weather, unintentionally, without realizing that he was planting another wound. That night, Claire cried inside, but smiled on the outside. She continued as if nothing had happened. But something changed. The hope she had harbored, the one that always returned even after her falls, began to transform into strength. Silently, she made a promise to herself. "One day, I will love myself so much that no one will be able to put me down anymore." It was just a sentence, but it was the spark that ignited everything that would come after. She would still fall many times. She would still hear many no's. But she would never again let anyone laugh at her without answering. And when fate took her back to the same man who had once put her down, she was no longer the same. It was the result of every pain transformed into determination. From an early age, Claire learned that the world made no concessions to those who were different. While other girls played parade in flared dresses, she watched from the window of her small room, where the baseboards were peeling, and the walls were marked with damp, as if they were also crying silently. Her mother left early to work in 2 family homes and returned late, too tired to ask questions but clear-headed enough to criticize her daughter's body. "Girl, no one will want you like that." That was the phrase she heard most often in her childhood. Claire ate in secret, not out of gluttony but for comfort. Each spoonful of stale rice with margarine was a silent refuge from loneliness. She had no siblings, no father. He had left when she was 5, leaving only a letter with empty promises and a pension that stopped arriving in the 3rd month. At school, Claire always arrived early and left quietly. She avoided the busy hallways. She learned to sit in the corners of the classroom, to hide her belly with her notebook, to pretend she was fine. Her classmates laughed at her snack, stale bread wrapped in a grocery bag, and at her uniform, which was too tight, inherited from her cousin. But she resisted. With the books, with the essays that earned her top marks, with the drawings she made hidden in her math notebook. She dreamed of being a teacher, maybe a writer. But every dream came with the same maternal reminder. Dreams don't fill your belly. You need to find someone to support you. Claire, even when she was quiet, knew she didn't want to depend on anyone. She just didn't know how to change that. Not yet. As a teenager, things got worse. Her body grew at an uncontrolled rate. Girls her age learned to wear makeup, but she learned to deal with cramps without medication and daily mockery. Once, a group of boys stuck a sticker on her back that said, "Overflowing." She only found out when she got home. She cried in the bathroom for hours without making a sound. Her mother, as always, blamed her daughter. "If you lost weight, no one would make fun of you." And this phrase was repeated for years like a poisoned mantra that stuck in her soul. College seemed like a relief, but it was just a change of scenery for the same script. There, Claire tried to reinvent herself. She wore modest but new clothes. She got a full scholarship thanks to her impeccable report card. It was the first time anyone had called her promising, and even without friends, she felt good. Until she met Ryan. Or rather, until she noticed his presence. He was the opposite of everything she knew. Handsome, confident, rich, popular. A whole universe away. But for a brief period, he treated her kindly. He lent her books, asked questions during group work, complimented a presentation. Claire, with her heart, already accustomed to scarcity, mistook cordiality for interest. She treasured his words like jewels. She wrote down dates, imagined stories. Until, one day, she heard him say something that brought her back down to earth. "You're nice, Claire. You just need to lose a few pounds to be perfect." He said it as if commenting on the weather. Unintentionally, without realizing that he was planting another wound. That night, Claire cried inside, but smiled on the outside. She continued as if nothing had happened. But something changed. The hope she had harbored, the one that always returned even after her falls, began to transform into strength. Silently, she made a promise to herself. One day, I will love myself so much that no one will be able to put me down anymore. It was just a sentence, but it was the spark that ignited everything that would come after. She would still fall many times. She would still hear many no's. But she would never again let anyone laugh at her without answering. And when fate took her back to the same man who had once put her down, she was no longer the same. It was the result of every pain transformed into determination. The restaurant was new, modern, the kind of place that seemed to want to prove something with every dish served. The yellowish lights created elegant shadows on the women's made-up faces and the men's gold watches. It was a casual reunion, called by a group of former students who now boasted positions in startups, international travel, and bodies shaped by cosmetic procedures. Claire hesitated before accepting the invitation, but something inside her told her that she needed to face that past. Not out of pride, but for closure. She knew that she was still not the woman she wanted to be, but she was also no longer the girl who hid in the photos. She put on her best dress, even if it was simple, put on lipstick in front of the mirror, took a deep breath, and went. Ryan arrived late. As usual. That was how he liked it. To make others wait. When he walked in, he was greeted with applause and jokes about his new business partnerships, his fancy car, his appearances in lifestyle magazines. Claire watched him from a distance, trying not to feel anything. He was more handsome, colder too. He smiled with his teeth but not with his eyes. When he finally saw her, it took him 2 seconds longer than necessary to acknowledge her. He greeted her with a restrained nod, as if she were part of the furniture. He sat down, ordered some expensive wine, and began to speak loudly. There was always a stage where Ryan was. It was then that one of the friends at the table, intoxicated by arrogance and alcohol, said the phrase that would become the root of everything. "Remember when we were in college, you said Claire was in love with you?" Ryan laughed, looked at her, then at the group, and replied with disdain. "She really was. She even said she would marry me if one day I would look at her as a woman. I said I would only marry her if she lost weight." The table burst into laughter. Claire froze, but he continued, laughing like someone who had no control. "I even made a bet back then with Nick. If she lost 20 kilos, I would go out with her. But apparently she gave up in the first week." Claire's eyes glazed over. Each word hit like shrapnel, and the cell phone started filming, as always happens when something cruel becomes entertainment. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stood up slowly, picked up her purse, and placed a package with a blue bow on the table. It was a gift for him, a rare book she knew he had admired in college, bought with great effort. Inside was a dedication. "I still believe that anyone can change." She left without another word. The table laughed louder, and Ryan finally opened the gift. He read the dedication, and the smile slowly faded, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. But it was too late. The video was already circulating in the message groups. The internet is fast, and judgment is relentless. In the hours that followed, his face began to appear with captions like, "Example of cruelty," "Bad joke," "Toxic arrogance." His fiancée saw it, the press saw it, his father saw it, and everything began to crumble, not because of a video, but because the mirror had finally been turned on him. Claire, outside, cried in the taxi, but they were different tears, not of shame, not of humiliation. They were tears of mourning for who she had once been, for the last time she had left that version of herself behind. Now she would choose her own paths, and none of them would take her back to the shadow of someone who mocked other people's pain as if it were a trophy. Time, contrary to what they say, does not heal everything, but it does reorganize. And it was in this slow and invisible pace that Claire rebuilt her life. Away from social media, away from the city where she was humiliated, away from everything that reminded her of pain. She changed her status, her routine, her public name. She enrolled in an intensive course in psychology applied to emotional pain and was surprised by her own thirst for knowledge. She studied at dawn, ran before sunrise, held therapy sessions for herself and others, discreetly, as an intern in a social project. She began to write without pretense. Short texts about self-esteem, open letters to women who felt unseen. One day, one of these texts went viral, and then another, and another, until the name Claire Sullivan began to be sought after by record labels, podcast invitations, and overcoming collections. She never wanted to be famous, but she knew that her story needed to serve someone. It needed to generate healing. It was in this new scenario, where the past no longer seemed to reach her, that Claire decided to open a small office. Nothing luxurious, just a calm space, with soft lighting, plants in repurposed pots, and shelves with the same books that had once saved her. She received patients, with the most diverse stories, many of them similar to her own, victims of exclusion, abandonment, cruel jokes, judgmental looks. Claire listened with the calm of someone who had been on the other end of the line, and she never mentioned her past. She let each session be about the other person, not about herself. On a gray morning, with a light rain wetting the sidewalk like hidden tears, Claire saw a figure at the reception desk. The face was familiar, but it was haggard, tired, withered. His shoulders hunched, his hands shaking as they held a registration form. Ryan. For a second, she thought it was a mistake, but when he looked up and met hers, there was a silence that could not be put into words. He tried to say something, but he only stammered. Claire? She kept her expression neutral, trained for it, and she answered calmly, Dr. Sullivan, please. That's what I'm known as here. He swallowed hard, lowered his eyes, and sat down as if carrying invisible stones on his back. Claire closed the door to the room, offered him water, and pointed to the padded armchair in front of hers. Ryan hesitated. The place seemed too small for the weight he was carrying. He sat down, and for several long seconds, he said nothing. He just looked at his feet. She was the one who spoke first. What brings you here? The simple question tore through a silence that had long lived within him. Ryan tried to answer, but his voice failed. He ran his hand through his hair and took a deep breath. I saw a video of myself from 3 years ago, and I can't look at myself in the mirror anymore. She didn't react. She didn't even blink. She let him continue. My fiancé left me. My father drove me away from the company. They don't trust me anymore. And I feel like I deserve it. Claire crossed her legs, rested her arms on the backrest, and in the same voice that had once been stifled said, Did you come for relief or redemption? He looked up slowly and saw something he hadn't expected, an absence of anger. Not a single word from her was harsh. Not a single look was judgmental. It was as if she wasn't there to avenge the past, but to see the present. Ryan didn't know how to react. He expected yelling. He expected contempt. But he found a woman who was confident, centered, and stronger than any version he had ever dared to imagine. The session continued with little progress, but he left shaken, because for the first time he saw someone he had hurt looking at, him without hatred, and that absence hurt more than any punishment. The news spread quickly among the corporate elite. The heir to Walker International had been officially removed from the presidency for unethical behavior and a public image incompatible with the company's values. The words were elegant, but everyone knew the real reason. The old video, the scandal on social media, the succession of canceled sponsorships, and the never-ending buzz. For months, Ryan tried to stay afloat. He gave ambiguous interviews, published generic apologies, wrote notes about a personal growth process, but no one believed him. The public wanted to see blood, companies wanted distance, and the society that had once exalted him now stood coldly by. The public downfall was not immediate, but it was cruel. The event that sealed the collective contempt came at a lecture on leadership and emotional intelligence that brought together business people, investors, and opinion makers. Claire had been invited to open the main panel with the theme, The Power of Vulnerability and Personal Reconstruction. She hesitated to accept, as she did not like the stage. But she knew that her story no longer belonged to her. It was a bridge to others. When she took the stage, Dressed soberly but elegantly, the audience fell silent. The opening video showed excerpts of anonymous letters she had received from women who had overcome trauma. Real voices. Real pain. In the middle of the audience, sitting in one of the last rows, was Ryan. He was no longer the man in the impeccable suit. He was visibly uncomfortable, dressed in modest clothes, with sunken eyes and an unshaven beard. He wanted to listen, to understand, perhaps to try to start over. But he did not expect Claire to speak directly about the past, and she did not. She did not say names. She did not mention dates. But she told the story of a girl who was humiliated in public by someone she admired, who had her body treated as an object of ridicule, who had to rebuild her own dignity without even receiving an honest apology. The audience listened in silence, and little by little, their eyes began to search, among the rows, for the hidden identity of the aggressor. Someone whispered Ryan's name. Another nudged a friend. "It's that guy from the video." And soon, without anyone saying anything, eyes began to turn to him. Claire didn't look at the back of the auditorium. She continued her speech firmly. She talked about the power of saying no, about the beauty of leaving environments where we are not respected. Meanwhile, Ryan shrank in his chair. He knew he couldn't run away. He felt the stares like beacons of judgment. When the talk ended, there was applause. Lots of applause. Claire thanked him with a slight smile, bowed, and stepped off the stage lightly. In the hallway, surrounded by people wanting photos and autographs, she caught a glimpse of Ryan's hunched figure leaving before the end. As he was leaving, a reporter approached him, recognizing him. "Mr. Walker, what did you think of the talk?" He hesitated, looked back as if expecting to see Claire watching, but she had already disappeared. Then, without any shield, he replied, "I thought she said exactly everything I needed to hear, and everything I deserved to feel." And he walked away, under flashes and cameras that now did not admire him, but recorded him as a symbol of a time that would never return. The office was quieter than usual that afternoon. The heavy sky was pouring a fine rain that ran down the windows as if the world outside was also withdrawn and introspective. Claire organized folders, answered emails, but her thoughts were far away. She knew he would return. She didn't know when or how, but she could feel it. And as if in a script written by fate, the doorbell rang at exactly 5:15. It was Ryan. Same dark suit, heavy eyes, slow steps. This time, there was no registration form, no bureaucracy. He simply said, "May I come in?" And Claire, with the same look that carried serenity and firmness, answered, "Of course, have a seat." He stood for a moment as if unsure if he deserved the space. When he finally sat down, he looked smaller. His shoulders hunched, his fingers clasped nervously. "Claire," he began, but she interrupted him gently. "Dr. Sullivan, please." He nodded, swallowed, and continued. "I know I have no right to ask for anything, but I need to understand. I need to know if you knew, if you saw that." Claire stood calmly, walked over to the bookshelf and pulled out a small black notebook, worn around the edges. She came back, sat across from him, and placed the notebook on the table between them. "You're asking me if I knew?" she said, her voice low but firm. "I knew the day I heard you repeat the bet as if it were a joke. I knew the moment you looked into my eyes and repeated the same words I heard from my mother when I was 9. I knew when I saw the blue package I had so lovingly left being thrown on the corner of the table. And then I knew every detail, because one of the people at that table was embarrassed and sent me the recording before the video went viral." Ryan's eyes widened. "You knew from the beginning?" She nodded, opened the notebook, and read aloud from one of the pages. It was a letter she had written to herself that night. "I won't take revenge. I will rebuild myself. And one day when he comes back, I won't scream. I will be the silence he never knew how to hear." He didn't know what to say. He stared at the floor. But Claire continued, "You weren't the first man to laugh at me." But you were the last, because that night I died, but not as a victim. I died as someone who expected validation from others, and I was reborn with the decision to never beg for affection again. The silence was thick, but not heavy. There was dignity in her words. There was freedom. Ryan tried to defend himself, more out of instinct than conviction. I was immature, stupid. I didn't realize what I was doing. Claire interrupted him again. And that's the scariest thing, that you hurt without realizing it, that you mocked someone's pain as if it were a casual joke. But I'm not here to condemn you, Ryan. I just needed you to know. I healed. Without you. She closed the notebook, put it back on the shelf, and stood. He didn't move. He just stared at her as if he were seeing a new person. And indeed he was. Claire was his own fortress now. And that fortress had walls built with every scornful word he had ever hurled into the wind. But there was no bitterness, no desire for revenge, only the knowledge that the woman before him had won, not because she had defeated him, but because she had nothing left to prove. The discovery didn't happen in a grand way. It didn't come through a theatrical revelation or a dramatic confrontation. It came like everything that truly changes life, in the details. After the last session, Ryan couldn't get her out of his mind. Not just out of guilt, but out of restlessness. Something about Claire escaped the logic he knew. It wasn't just overcoming. There was something more. A strength he couldn't name. But that bothered him. Because it was genuine. He started researching. Not the viral videos nor the recent articles, but the subtext. He read all the texts she had published under pseudonyms years ago. He searched through old archives of social projects. And it was in a forgotten article, in an NGO's virtual library, that he found an old interview without a photo, signed only with the name CS. The text covered child abandonment, silent eating disorders, and how one young woman had learned to turn humiliation into wisdom. But there was one passage that stopped him cold. Claire spoke of a specific night in college when she nearly took her own life. I was in my room, with the lights off, and a letter was ready on the table. No one would know. No one would care. Then I heard a phrase on the old radio in the kitchen. You are more than meets the eye. In that moment, I cried for the first time like I wanted to stay alive. Ryan recoiled from the screen. His stomach turned. That night. That week. It was the same one he had made the bet. The pieces began to fit together. It wasn't just about humiliation. It was about life. About the abyss she had almost fallen into. And he had never known. He had never even imagined. That had hurt him more than any scandal. Because now he knew that what he had said had not only hurt, it had almost killed. And yet, years later, she had welcomed him with kindness. The weight of that truth was too much for him. He had to leave, walk, breathe. He spent the night reviewing memories, trying to remember if, at some point, he had offered her anything other than contempt. But no, he had always been neglectful, blind, cruel. The next day he went to the office. He wanted to talk, to tell him he knew. But he found only the secretary. Claire had gone on a silent retreat. She had left a sealed letter addressed to him. She was waiting for his arrival. Ryan sat in the reception area, the letter in his hands. He opened it. Inside was a single sheet. Her handwriting was firm and clear. Now you know. And with that you have two choices. Blame yourself forever or turn this pain into purpose. Life broke me. You too. But the rebuilding was mine. I owe no one anything. If one day you want to speak as a human being, not as a defendant, I will be there. But not so you can redeem yourself. So you can learn to live with what you did. And do something with it. Claire. He held the paper for a few minutes. Then he folded it carefully and tucked it into his pocket. There was no signature at the bottom. Just a hand-drawn flower, the same one she'd scribbled in her college notebooks. And in that instant, Ryan realized that Claire wasn't just the girl he'd ignored. She was the mirror he'd been running from. the reflection that forced him to see, the man he'd become, and more importantly, the man he could still be, if he had the courage. Time passed differently after that letter. Ryan kept the page inside a book, as if hiding a piece of truth that he doesn't yet know how to face. For days he tried to continue with his routine, or with what was left of it. He went to the office of the Social Foundation where he now worked as a volunteer, participated in discussion groups with marginalized youth, organized donations for shelters, and read. He read as if he were trying to relearn the world. But even surrounded by so many voices, he heard the echo of Claire's silence. She hadn't left a contact information or a return date. She had simply left. And for the first time in his life, Ryan felt what it was like to be on the other side of absence. Not the kind that one perceives with reason, but the kind that corrodes deep within the soul. Every morning, I would walk past the office, pretending it was just a detour. I expected to see the lights on, her silhouette behind the white curtains, the sound of the doorbell announcing her return. But nothing. The days got darker earlier that winter, as if time itself wanted to spare him the wait. In the third week, he decided to write a letter. Not to apologize, but to tell her. To tell her that he had started visiting the psychiatric ward of a public hospital to talk to patients. That he had reconnected with his mother, whom he hadn't spoken to in years. That now I was reading about. Empathy, not as a concept, but as an urgency. She didn't know if Claire would read it, but she needed her actions to have a recipient, even if imaginary. During one of his visits to the hospital, he met a young woman with a severe eating disorder. The girl's name was Anna Beatrice, and she resembled Claire in many ways. Not in her appearance, but in the way she looked at the floor when she talked about herself. Ryan sat next to her for over an hour. He listened without interrupting. And at the end, he said, "Someone I hurt once taught me that our value is not in what others see. It's in what we build in silence." The girl cried. So did he. And in that cry, something in Ryan broke for good. The rest of the man he pretended to be finally fell away, and for the first time it didn't hurt. It freed him. At night, lying on the couch in the small apartment he was now renting, he picked up the book with Claire's letter hidden inside. He reread it. The handwriting seemed even firmer. He wanted to respond, but he didn't know how. It was then that he remembered the flower drawn at the bottom of the page. It was a magnolia. He researched its meaning. Dignity, perseverance, rebirth. He remained silent for a few minutes, as if he were talking to someone even without seeing them. Then, the next day, he returned to the office. It was still closed. But there was something different. An envelope discreetly stuck to the door, with his name on it. Inside, a card, handwritten. Just a few words. Disappearing isn't always running away. Sometimes it's just breathing. You haven't lost me. You just need to learn not to need me to carry on. Ryan smiled, his eyes brimming with tears. He put the note in his breast pocket, where his heart was still learning to be less stone and more flesh. And there, standing in front of the closed door, he understood what Claire had always known. Absence is also presence, when what was left was true. The city that once applauded him now seemed to have no place for him. Doors that once opened with a phone call remained closed even when he knocked humbly. Business events ignored him. Invitations disappeared. But Ryan accepted everything with resigned silence. It wasn't anger nor self-pity. It was a kind of silent penance. He knew that this rejection didn't just come from other people's cruelty, but was a reflection of who he was. And now, for the first time, he didn't try to change that perception. He just allowed himself to feel and to move on. But the final blow came when he least expected it. The Social Foundation where he worked as a volunteer was undergoing restructuring and decided to call an open meeting to discuss its future. The new coordinator, upon discovering the old scandals involving Ryan, decided it would be best to remove him. He claimed that keeping someone with that history, even if he regretted it, would compromise the trust of the project. The meeting took place in a small auditorium, but it was packed with people that Ryan had helped, listened to, and welcomed in recent months. He showed up without knowing what would be said, and he stood in the corner while he listened to his exclusion being loudly debated. Despite Mr. Walker's recent contribution, the coordinator said, the image he carries violates the principles of our mission. We need to be an example, and an example is not built only with good intentions, but with a clean record. The words cut deeper than the old headlines, because now he was different. He was no longer that man. And yet, it was not enough. Some present agreed with his dismissal. Others remained silent. But a young man in the back of the room raised his hand. It was Theo, a former drug addict whom Ryan had been seeing for weeks. He spoke slowly, his voice hoarse but firm. I learned here that no one is the same as they were on the worst day of their life. If they gave me a chance, why can't he have one too? The room divided. A small group defended him. Others maintained their judgment. In the end, the majority decided temporary suspension until further deliberation. Ryan did not react. He thanked them. He left through the front door, without speeches, without justifications, but with the wet eyes of someone who no longer cried for himself, but for the time lost in being someone he should never have been. He walked through the streets as if floating among memories. And in every shop window, on every corner, he seemed to see reflections of the old Ryan, the one who smiled in public and mocked between the lines. And then he understood. His punishment was not to be excluded. It was to recognize himself in the ruins. That night, alone at home, he wrote a letter, not to Claire, not to the foundation, but to himself. Today I felt real shame, not because of the rejection, but because I realized that for so long I thought I was the center, when in fact I was just a shadow. Now I understand why it disappeared, because it's not about forgiveness. It's about no longer carrying the weight of the person who hurt you. He folded the letter and put it in the same box where the other notes were, and he slept like someone who doesn't know if he'll be accepted again, but no longer depends on it to move forward. The following days were marked by silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of someone who doesn't know what to say, but the necessary silence of someone who is finally beginning to listen. Ryan began to frequent places he would never have set foot in before. Active listening workshops in underprivileged communities, conversation circles for victims of violence, women's shelters. He went without a badge, without posing, without rushing. He sat in the back, listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, he never said who he was. He wasn't looking for protagonism, he was looking for presence. And little by little, people began to call him simply Ryan. Not the heir, not the businessman, but the man with watchful eyes and careful words. At home, the transformation was even more discreet. He sold the last luxury goods he still kept as a remnant of another life. He gave away suits, expensive shoes, and designer watches. He traded his apartment for a smaller place, with fewer mirrors and more books. He started waking up early, making his own coffee, and walking alone in the park with a notepad in his hands. There, he wrote down everything he saw and learned. Simple things: a child crying, a lady helping a stray dog, a street vendor reading the Bible between sales. For the first time, Ryan saw the world without being at its center. He began writing letters, not to send, just to write, one a week. Some to Claire, some to himself at different ages. Letters to the boy who tried to get his father's attention with good grades. To the teenager who learned to hide his insecurity with arrogance. To the young man who treated people like objects. And especially to the woman he had nearly destroyed with his words. In all of them, the tone was the same. Not empty regret, but understanding. Not pleas for forgiveness, but declarations of responsibility. Because now he knew that true forgiveness only happens when the other person's pain becomes yours too. It was during one of his solitary walks that he saw a scene that disarmed him. A young woman sitting on a bench was crying silently. Her shoulders were shaking, but she didn't make a sound. He approached her slowly and asked if he could sit down. She nodded without looking. And there, without knowing her name, her story, he just stood. Waited. When she finally looked up, he simply said, "I won't tell you it'll go away. But if you want, I can stay here while it hurts." She cried again, louder, with freedom. And Ryan felt in that moment that his place in the world was changing, not because of applause, but because of listening. That night he returned home and lit a candle. He placed it in front of the living room mirror, the only one he kept, and looked at himself honestly. He no longer saw the arrogant face of his past. He saw new wrinkles, deeper eyes, a serene expression. For the first time, he felt no shame. He felt peace, not because he had been accepted, but because he had finally accepted himself as a work in progress. And there, in the flickering reflection of the flame, he whispered, "Now I understand." Then he blew out the candle, went to the box of letters, and wrote one last one. "Claire, if life ever crosses our path again, may it not be to correct the past, but to recognize who we were capable of becoming. It was by chance. Or maybe not." Ryan no longer believed in coincidences. He had learned that some scenes repeat themselves in life, not as punishment, but as a new chance to see things differently. That afternoon, he was leaving a public library where he had started to teach small therapeutic writing workshops for vulnerable young people. The sidewalk was wet from a recent rainstorm, leaving the air clean, humid, full of the smell of earth and new beginnings. He was crossing the square when he heard a low laugh coming from under a tree. A familiar laugh. He stopped, turned slowly, and saw it. Claire, sitting on a wooden bench, her hair loose, a book in her hands, sunglasses on, and a cup of tea resting next to her. She didn't see him right away. She seemed immersed in her reading, and for a second, Ryan considered leaving, but his feet didn't move. She looked up and saw him. Time froze between them. There were no smiles, no shock, just a silent recognition of two paths crossing again after having traveled immeasurable internal distances. He approached slowly, without speaking. He stopped a few steps away, respecting her space. Claire took off her glasses, looked directly into his eyes, and in that look there was everything. Memory, pain, overcoming, but also something unexpected. Peace. "Hi, Claire," he said, his voice low, almost afraid to break the spell of the moment. She nodded. Ryan. No other name was needed, no excuses, no apologies. They both knew. They had been through it all. They had been through what needed to be said. He glanced at the bench next to her. "May I?" She looked into space, then back at him. "If it's just to sit, yes." He smiled, a small, almost pained smile. He sat down. For a few minutes, they were silent. The rustling of leaves, the distant sound of children playing, the world kept spinning, but there was a pause. A sacred pause. The first to speak. "I thought I would never see you again." She answered without looking directly at him. "Because you don't understand what it's like to disappear in order to exist again. Sometimes, absence is the only place where we become whole again." He took a deep breath. "I know that now." Claire closed the book. She looked at his hands. They were the same, but they carried a different energy. They no longer gestured like before. They didn't try to dominate the air. They just rested in. His lap serene. "Why are you here?" she asked. Ryan took a moment. "I don't know. Maybe because I never thanked you for showing me who I was, and for letting me discover who I could be." She didn't answer right away. She picked up her teacup and took a sip. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for me." He nodded. "And yet, it changed me." Claire was silent. Then she said, "What do you expect from me now, Ryan?" He looked ahead, where an elderly couple walked hand in hand. "Nothing. Just that you know I've changed. Not so you can forgive me, but so I can look at myself again." She looked at him, and saw him. Not the arrogant boy from college, not the man who'd humiliated her in the restaurant, but someone who'd been through hell and come back with clearer eyes. You look tired, she said. He smiled lightly. It's just that being honest takes more work than appearing perfect. She didn't say anything else. She just put the bookmark in the book, stood up, and said, I'll go. But thank you for not running away. He followed her with his eyes. He didn't try to stop her, didn't ask for more time. He just watched. And as she walked away, he knew that this reunion wasn't about reconciliation. It was about recognition. The kind that doesn't need promises, just presence. And that presence in itself was a miracle. The sun was already setting when Claire arrived home that night. The windows were ajar, and a light breeze wafted through the rooms, carrying the scent of the lavender. Incense she had left lit before leaving. She dropped her shoes in the entryway, placed her book on the table, and sat down in her favorite chair facing the porch. Outside, the sky was a gradient between orange and dark blue. Her hands were cold, but her heart was restless. The reunion with Ryan had not caused her anger or hurt. It had caused something harder to explain. An inner silence, as if all the questions she thought she still had for him had dissolved in the tired look she saw in his eyes. She stood there for a while, motionless. Then she got up, went to her desk, and picked up an old envelope, kept among her notebooks. Inside was a piece of paper he had written years ago, around the time he decided to disappear. It was a list. Things I need to forgive. At the top was his name. Scribbled, crossed out, rewritten, then crossed out again. It was a letter he had never delivered. She read it in silence. You felt nothing. No pain. No indignation. And then you understood. You know. Longer had to decide whether to forgive him. Because I had already moved on. Because forgiveness sometimes is not a concession to the other person. It is a symbolic cutting of what still holds us back. And she was no longer bound. Claire didn't write, didn't answer, didn't call. She just took a deep breath, put the list back in the envelope, and put it in the box where she kept memories that no longer hurt. The next day, she went back to her routine. She saw patients, wrote a new article, had coffee with a friend. But something in her had changed, a lightness that was imperceptible to others but essential to her. At lunchtime, she went for a walk. She passed by the square. The bench was still there, empty. She sat for a few minutes. Then she left a folded note, stuck under a rock. No name, no recipient, just one sentence. If you're trying to change, keep going. No one needs to know. You just need to know. Across town, Ryan was leaving another workshop for young people in recovery. He had helped organize a mural with quotes written by the participants. One of them caught his eye. Pain doesn't go away when it's acknowledged. It changes. He didn't know who wrote it, but it felt like it had been written for him. That night he walked aimlessly through the wet streets until, on impulse, he took the same path to the square. He wanted to see the bench again. He didn't know if she would be there. He only knew that he needed to go back to the place where something inside him had finally been seen. He found the bench empty, and the note. He read it. He recognized the handwriting, and he smiled. Not with happiness, but with acceptance. It wasn't an invitation, nor a farewell. She was what Claire had always been to him, without him realizing it. A mirror. And now for the first time he saw something worthy reflected back at him. He folded the note carefully, put it in his breast pocket, and walked in silence. He didn't know if he would ever see her again. But he knew that wherever she was, her life no longer revolved around him. And that, for Ryan, was the fairest of truths. On the shelf of a small independent bookstore, on a quiet street, there was a copy of the book, Invisible Wounds. It was a new edition, with a minimalist cover, just the title in gold relief and a delicate drawing of a magnolia in the lower corner. Among the self-help and memoir books, this one seemed to pulsate. Next to it, a bookmark left on purpose by the author. No advertising, no autographs, just a handwritten sentence. What survives is not what overcomes, but what understands. A young woman was leafing through the book. She had been through things she couldn't name yet. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages. On the other side of the store, Ryan watched in silence. He didn't intervene. He didn't come closer. He just smiled as he saw the impact of Claire's words touching someone else. He picked up another copy, paid for it, and left without being noticed. He walked down the narrow street until he reached the square where it all began and ended. The bench was still there, but now it had signs of age, chips on the sides, and a small flower growing between the wooden planks, a magnolia, alone but standing. He sat down, opened the book, and put inside the note he had once found there. Then he closed it, placed it on the bench, got up and walked away. He didn't take anything. He just left it. In the background, the breeze moved the pages like ancient whispers that had finally found rest. And the world went on, as it always does, but with an extra story hidden between the lines, the kind that no one can explain, but everyone can feel. If you've come this far, it's because this story touched you in some way. So write in the comments, "I believe in silent new beginnings," just so I know you felt the weight of this transformation along with me. Don't forget to leave your like. It helps this story reach more people who also need to hear this. Message. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next plots, because each story here carries more than emotion. It carries truth. And now click on the video that's appearing on the screen, because the next story may move you even more than this one.